Outside the window, the streets of New York remained restless, neon lights reflecting off rain-slicked pavement, the distant hum of traffic, hurried footsteps against the sidewalks. The city never slept. But inside a small apartment on the 10th floor, everything was suffocatingly silent. Eleanor awoke to the dim light of dawn filtering through the curtains. Slowly she turned, but the bed beside her was cold and empty. She closed her eyes, trying to suppress the ache creeping into her chest. 2 days. It had been 2 days since Jonah left, taking nothing but a small suitcase, leaving behind an absence that weighed heavier than words. She reached out, fingers brushing against the sheets where he used to sleep, untouched, as if he had never returned. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor pushed herself out of bed and walked into the kitchen. Her hands instinctively reached for 2 mugs from the shelf, then froze. A habit built over years, now utterly pointless. The coffee dripped into the cup, the rich aroma filling the air, but no one sat across from her to share the quiet of the morning. Everything remained the same, and yet nothing was as it was before. The aroma of coffee filled the kitchen, but it no longer brought the warmth it once did. Eleanor sat at the table, fingers curled around her mug, her gaze lost in the city beyond the window. Her mind wasn't in the present anymore. It had drifted back to where it all began. How had they fallen in love? It was a winter afternoon in a small cafe on the corner of the street where Jonah first saw her. He had been in the middle of interviewing someone for an investigative piece, while Eleanor sat tucked away in a quiet corner, lost in her design sketches. A fleeting moment, a passing glance, but Jonah couldn't look away. He had taken a single photo, just one, before walking over to introduce himself. "Do you know how intense you look when you're focused?" Jonah had asked, holding up his camera with a knowing smile. Eleanor had looked up, mildly surprised, before offering a small, amused smirk. Should I be flattered or concerned? That was how it started, from casual conversations to endless nights wandering through the city. Jonah had led her through hidden alleyways, showing her late-night diners only locals knew. Eleanor, in turn, introduced him to her world. Sleek designs, carefully curated spaces, the beauty in structured details. Evenings spent on the rooftop of their apartment, hands intertwined, gazing at the glowing skyline. Jonah would share the stories he uncovered in his work, while Eleanor painted vivid dreams of a perfect home and a life built together. Once, Jonah had pulled her into his arms, right in the middle of a crowded street, simply because a song drifted from a nearby bar. "Dance with me," he whispered. "Here?" Eleanor had laughed, but in the end, she let him guide her, swaying slowly among strangers. They had believed their love could survive anything, but now, as Eleanor sat alone, she found herself wondering, was their love really strong enough? Eleanor tightened her grip around the coffee mug, the warmth seeping into her palms. The memories of their happiest days still lingered, but when she closed her eyes, another image surfaced. One far removed from those golden moments. They had once been so happy, but the cracks had begun to form. Everything changed when Eleanor started longing for a family. She had always dreamed of a home filled with warmth, where their mornings would no longer be just the 2 of them, but filled with the laughter of a child, the soft chatter of a family at the dinner table. She had believed that Jonah wanted the same, that they were building that future together. But month after month, every pregnancy test came back negative. At first, they reassured each other. Jonah would smile, pull Eleanor into his arms, kiss her forehead, and whisper, "We have time, Ellie. There's no rush." But as time passed with no change, a quiet worry took root in Eleanor's heart. She suggested they see a doctor, just to be sure. Jonah hesitated. He avoided her gaze, making excuses to delay the appointment over and over again. But eventually, the day came. They sat in the doctor's office, Eleanor clutching Jonah's hand tightly as the doctor delivered the results. The problem wasn't with her, it was with him. Jonah was infertile. Eleanor turned to him, searching for any emotion on his face, but he remained silent. On the way home, he didn't say a word. In the days that followed, Jonah started to change. He no longer smiled in the mornings. He stopped pulling her into his arms the way he used to. When she tried to comfort him, to tell him they still had options, that they could still be parents in other ways. Jonah only shook his head, his eyes distant. "I just need time, Ellie," he had said that. But time passed, and the space between them only grew wider. Conversations became fewer, touches became colder, and then, one day, Eleanor realized Jonah no longer looked at her the way he once did. She felt like she was losing him piece by piece. And worst of all, she didn't know how to hold on. Eleanor couldn't remember the last time Jonah had truly looked at her. Not the fleeting glances of indifference or the empty stares across the room. She meant the way he used to look at her. His eyes filled with warmth, tenderness, and the longing to build a future together. But now, all that remained was distance. At first, Eleanor tried. She cooked his favorite meals, planned weekend getaways in hopes of rekindling what they had lost. But Jonah always had an excuse. He became busier than ever, burying himself in work, coming home late, spending nights locked in his office. Every time she tried to reach him, tried to pull him closer, Jonah would offer a strained smile, kiss her forehead, and whisper that he was fine. But Eleanor knew he wasn't fine, and neither was she. Nights spent lying in the same bed, yet facing opposite directions. Silent dinners, where the only sounds were the clinking of silverware against plates. The countless times she reached for him in the middle of the night, only to be met with emptiness instead of his warmth. She realized something heartbreaking. They were still together, yet they had lost each other long ago. And so, Eleanor made her decision. One late afternoon, she placed the divorce papers on the table. When Jonah walked in, he stopped, his eyes briefly scanning the document. There was no outburst, no plea for her to stay, just a slow, accepting nod. She had hoped he would fight for them, but instead, he let her go. Eleanor thought signing the divorce papers would bring her closure. Instead, it left a deeper void inside her. The day before their court appointment, she returned to the apartment to gather a few forgotten belongings. While rummaging through Jonah's desk drawer, a white envelope with a hospital seal caught her eye. Her heart pounded as she carefully opened it. The words on the document made the world around her blur. Jonathan Miller, diagnosis, leukemia. She froze, the paper trembling in her hands. Her breath hitched, her vision blurred. The walls around her seemed to close in as an unbearable weight crushed her chest. Eleanor read the lines again, once, twice, her hands gripping the edges of the paper so tightly that it crumpled beneath her fingers. Her knees buckled and she sank onto the floor. Jonah hadn't just pulled away because of infertility. He had known about his illness all along, and he had chosen to keep it from her. He was going to leave her, not because he wanted to, but because he thought he had no choice. And that realization broke her. A storm of emotions crashed over her. Pain, anger, fear. Why had he decided to bear this alone? Why did he think she would be better off without him? She thought back to the nights he stayed up late, the moments he hesitated, as if he wanted to say something but never did. He never intended for her to know. He planned to leave, letting her believe the distance between them was inevitable. Eleanor gripped the paper tightly, tears spilling down her cheeks. She couldn't let this happen. She wouldn't let him go through this alone. Tomorrow, at the courthouse, Jonah wouldn't be the one stopping her from signing the papers. She would be the one to stop him. The courtroom felt suffocatingly cold. Light poured in through the tall windows, casting harsh reflections on the polished wooden floor. The lawyer's voice droned on, detached and emotionless, as he read the final terms of their divorce. Eleanor sat across from Jonah. Her hands were clasped so tightly that her nails dug into her palms, but she didn't loosen her grip. Through it all, Jonah never once looked at her. Then, the divorce papers were placed in front of them. Jonah reached for the pen, without hesitation, without looking up. He lowered the pen to sign. "Stop," her voice cracked, trembling but unwavering. Jonah stilled. For the first time in months, he looked at her. His eyes widened in disbelief, as if he hadn't expected this. Eleanor shot to her feet, pulling a set of medical records from her bag. Without a word, she pushed them toward him. "Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" Her voice wavered. Did you actually believe I'd sign these papers without knowing the truth?" Jonah didn't respond, but she saw the way his fingers curled tightly around the pen, knuckles turning white. "How long?" Her voice broke. "How long have you known? How long have you carried this alone, convinced that I would be better off without you?" Jonah inhaled sharply but still said nothing. Eleanor's breath came in ragged gasps as tears burned her eyes. "Did you really think I could live without you?" she choked out. "Did you truly believe I'd be okay losing you?" Jonah dropped his gaze, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just didn't want you to suffer." "You idiot!" A sob tore through Eleanor's throat as she grabbed the divorce papers. Before Jonah could stop her, she ripped them apart, shredding the pages into pieces that fluttered onto the table like fallen snow. The sound of tearing paper cut through the silence like a blade. Jonah stared, speechless. Then, without hesitation, Eleanor threw herself into his arms. Her fingers clutched at his shirt, her sobs muffled against his chest. Her voice came in desperate, broken whispers. "Please, Jonah, don't leave me." Jonah's entire body went rigid. He could feel the warmth of her, the way her heart pounded against his own. She trembled in his embrace, and for the first time, he realized he no longer had the strength to push her away. Jonah didn't know how long he sat there, only that Eleanor was still clinging to him, her shoulders shaking with every muffled sob. His hands hovered in the air, torn between holding her close and pushing her away. But when her voice cracked, "Please, Jonah, don't leave me," his walls crumbled. Slowly, as if afraid she would disappear, he wrapped his arms around her. Eleanor sobbed against his chest, her grip on his shirt unrelenting. "You're cruel, Jonah," her voice trembled. "You made this decision without me. You thought I'd be happier without you? You thought I could go on like you never existed?" Jonah closed his eyes. He had tried to protect her, to spare her from this pain. But he had been so wrong. He had hurt her far worse than the illness ever could. "I'm sorry." His voice was barely above a whisper. Eleanor lifted her tear-streaked face, eyes blazing. "You don't get to apologize. You only get to promise me one thing." Jonah stared at her for a long moment before nodding. "Anything, Ellie." She gripped his hands tightly, her voice still shaking. "Let me fight this with you. Don't shut me out." Jonah drew in a deep breath. For the first time in months, his eyes softened, not with resignation, but with something real. No more pretending to be strong, no more pushing her away, just a man learning to hold on to the one person who refused to let him go. "I promise." And with that promise, their battle truly began. The days that followed were nothing like before. Eleanor put aside every pending project, dedicating herself entirely to Jonah. She accompanied him to every doctor's appointment, every chemotherapy session, every exhausting moment that drained the life out of him. The first few days were brutal. Jonah wasn't used to letting someone see him weak. He tried to act strong, to pretend he was fine, but Eleanor saw through it all. She saw the way his hands trembled when he held his cup, the exhaustion in his eyes as the medication coursed through his veins. "You don't have to be strong for me," one night she whispered while sitting beside his hospital bed, her fingers gently wrapping around his. Jonah turned away, but Eleanor didn't let him retreat. "Just let me stay. Let me be the one to hold you this time." For the first time, Jonah nodded. And so Eleanor stayed every hour, every day. When nausea left him unable to eat, she patiently fed him spoon by spoon. When the pain became unbearable and he couldn't sleep, she sat beside him reading aloud, her voice steady and soothing like a lullaby. When he felt like he was losing himself, she held his hand tighter and whispered, "You're still Jonah to me. You always will be." She had always thought Jonah was the strongest person she knew, but now she realized true strength wasn't about hiding the pain. It was about letting someone in to share it. And though the road ahead was long and uncertain, for the first time in months, Jonah no longer felt alone. Time passed, hour by hour, day by day. The pain, the chemotherapy sessions, the moments when Jonah collapsed from exhaustion. Eleanor was there for it all. She watched him fight, watched him push through. But some days were harder than others, days when Jonah felt like he couldn't go on. "Ellie, I'm so tired." One night Jonah whispered, his voice so faint she barely heard him. Eleanor held his hand tighter, her vision blurred with tears. "Then be tired. You have every right to be exhausted, to be scared, but you don't have the right to give up. You promised me, remember?" Jonah didn't respond for a long time. Then, slowly, he squeezed her hand back, a silent answer. The days stretched on in the hospital, each checkup, each test result, a weight pressing on Eleanor's chest. Every time the doctor walked into the room, she held her breath. Then, one spring morning, the doctor entered with a small smile. "Jonah, your latest results show significant improvement." Eleanor's head snapped up, her heart hammering. "You mean?" The doctor nodded. "The treatment is working. If we continue at this rate, we can hope for long-term remission." Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes instantly. She turned to Jonah, but he only stared at her, as if he still couldn't believe it. Eleanor didn't say anything. She just threw herself into his arms, holding him as tightly as she could. This time, Jonah didn't try to be strong. He simply held her back and let himself cry. For the first time in a long, long time. On a peaceful summer evening, Jonah and Eleanor sat on their apartment rooftop, the city lights stretching before them like fallen stars. Jonah glanced at Eleanor, who rested her head on his shoulder, her breathing steady, as if, finally, she could relax after all the battles they had fought. "I never thought we'd have this day," he murmured. Eleanor tilted her head up, her gaze gentle yet unwavering. "And what else do you think, Jonah?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Eleanor's breath hitched. He opened it, revealing a simple yet beautiful ring that shimmered under the city lights. "I once made you a promise, Ellie, in sickness and in health. But tonight I want to promise you again, not out of obligation, not because of vows, but because I truly want to." Eleanor's voice broke. "Jonah!" He let out a soft laugh, one that for the first time in a long while wasn't weighed down by sorrow. "Marry me again, Eleanor. Not because we have to, but because we want to." Eleanor couldn't stop the tears from falling, but this time, she wasn't crying out of pain or fear. She nodded, without hesitation. "Yes. 1,000 times, yes." Jonah grinned as he slid the ring onto her finger. This time, it wasn't just a vow. It was a choice, a love that had been tested and had come out stronger than ever. 1 year later. That morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over everything it touched. Eleanor stood frozen in the bathroom, staring at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands. 2 lines. The world blurred around her, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. "No way," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes as she stared at the result again. She had accepted long ago that they would never have a child, that it simply wasn't meant to be. But now, she stepped out of the bathroom, her legs barely holding her up. Jonah was in the kitchen, making coffee like any other morning. When he saw her, he immediately set the cup down, concern flashing in his eyes. "Ellie, what's wrong?" Eleanor couldn't speak. She simply held up the pregnancy test. Jonah looked down, and his entire world shifted. "Ellie?" His voice cracked, his hands trembling as he took the small test from her. Eleanor let out a sob. "I'm pregnant, Jonah." Jonah went utterly still, and then, as the realization hit, he let out a breathless, broken laugh. A laugh filled with joy, disbelief, and overwhelming emotion. He grabbed her, lifting her into his arms and spinning her around the kitchen, his own tears mixing with hers. "We're having a baby! Ellie, we're having a baby!" But their miracle wasn't over yet. 3 weeks later, Jonah sat in the hospital, his fingers interlocked with Eleanor's. The familiar scent of antiseptic filled the air, the beeping of machines echoing in the background. Eleanor's grip on his hand was tight, too tight, but neither of them said anything. The doctor flipped through the pages, pausing briefly before looking up. A small, knowing smile crossed his face. "Jonah, I have good news." He placed the file on the desk. "There are no remaining signs of cancer. We can officially say You're in complete remission." For a moment, there was only silence. Jonah stared at the doctor unblinking, his mind struggling to process the words. Eleanor was the first to react. She let out a shaky gasp, her free hand covering her mouth as tears spilled over. Jonah turned to her, and when their eyes met, the truth finally sank in. He wasn't dying, he was living. And in that moment, he pulled Eleanor into his arms, holding on to her as if anchoring himself to this newfound future. Eleanor's breath caught as she turned to Jonah, but Jonah just sat there, eyes wide, as if unable to believe what he had just heard. He had once thought he had no future, that everything had already been taken from him. But now, his fingers tightened around Eleanor's, grounding himself in her warmth. She began to cry, not out of fear, not out of grief, but out of a joy so immense it felt like her heart might burst. "We did it, Jonah. You did it." Jonah let out a shaky laugh, tears slipping down his cheeks. He pulled Eleanor into his arms, pressing his forehead against hers. "No, Ellie, we did it. Together." And for the first time in a long, long time, they could look toward the future without fear. A miracle had happened, and this time they would cherish it, together, forever.